What is the price of immortality? Not for a person, but for a nation, for a bloodline. What price would you pay to build a dynasty so strong, so unshakable, that it could stare down the most terrifying army the world had ever known? Not once, not twice, but 3 times, and win. Imagine a kingdom forged in fire and rebellion. Jai Viet in the 13th century. To the north, a storm is gathering. The Mongol Empire, a relentless, world-consuming horde led by the descendants of Genghis Khan, has already swallowed half of Eurasia. They are the great filter of civilizations. Nations rise and fall at the thunderous sound of their horses' hooves, and their eyes are turning south, towards the fertile plains of Vietnam. In this crucible of history, a new dynasty arises, the Tran. They would become the stuff of legend, the dragon slayers, the giant killers. Their military genius, led by the transcendent commander Tran Hung Giao, is a story told to every Vietnamese child. They are the saviors, the protectors, the very shield of the nation. But every shield has a dark side, a hidden face that is never shown in the glorious tapestries of victory. What if I told you that the secret to the Tran's unbreakable unity, the very foundation of their power that allowed them to defy the Mongols, was a taboo, a sin so profound, it violates the most basic laws of nature and man? What if the price of saving the nation from an outside threat was to consume itself from within? They built a fortress to protect their bloodline, but they built it with walls of flesh and bone, locking themselves inside a gilded cage of their own making. This is not a story of heroes and villains. It is the story of the sinner saints of Jai Viet, the story of a dynasty that, in its obsessive quest for purity and power, embraced the ultimate impurity, systematic, generation-spanning, clinical inbreeding. This is the dark history of the Tran dynasty's sacred sin. In why that is the question that echoes through the 7 centuries separating us from the Tran court. Why would a lineage of brilliant strategists, pious Buddhists, and national heroes resort to a practice that most cultures, then and now, intuitively recoil from? Was it a collective madness, a cultural quirk, a moral blind spot of epic proportions? The answer is far more terrifying. It was not madness. It was a strategy, a cold, calculated, and ruthless political doctrine born from fear and ambition. To understand it, we must rewind the clock slightly. To the dynasty the Tran replaced the Li dynasty. The Li dynasty had ruled for over 2 centuries, a golden age of art, religion, and culture. But its end was not marked by war or rebellion, but by a quiet, internal implosion. The last rulers failed to produce a male heir. The final monarch, a fragile child, was the Empress Li Chieu Huang. The power of the court, the fate of the nation, rested in the hands of a little girl, and into this power vacuum stepped a cunning, ambitious clan, the Tran. The man pulling the strings was Tran Thu Jo, a name that inspires both awe and terror in Vietnamese history. He was the kingmaker, the shadow chancellor, the architect of the new dynasty. He saw precisely how the Li had fallen. Their power had been diluted, their authority challenged, and ultimately, their mandate from heaven had evaporated because they couldn't control their own succession. A daughter could be married off to a rival clan, her power and legitimacy siphoned away, bleeding the dynasty dry. This is exactly what the Tran clan did to the Li. Tran Thu Jo orchestrated the marriage of his 8-year-old nephew, Tran Khan, to the 7-year-old Empress Li Chieu Huang. Within a year, he had forced her to abdicate, handing the throne and the entire nation to her new husband, who became the first emperor of the Trần Dynasty. Trần Thu Zhou had learned a brutal lesson: power that can be transferred through marriage to an outsider is power that can be lost. His solution was as simple as it was monstrous: to ensure the Trần clan would never suffer the same fate. The power must never, ever leave the family. The bloodline must be kept pure, not for reasons of racial supremacy, but for political security. If the emperor's only suitable brides are his own cousins, sisters, or aunts, then the throne can never pass to a rival. The clan becomes a closed loop, a self-sustaining political ecosystem. It was a firewall against the outside world, built from the very fabric of family. It was a promise that a Trần would always rule, because a Trần would only ever marry a Trần. The question they faced was, is it better to risk genetic decay in a distant future, or to risk immediate political annihilation by a rival lord who marries your daughter for Trần Thu Zhou? The choice was clear. He would sacrifice sanctity for stability. He would trade the laws of nature for the laws of power. And in doing so, he set his dynasty on a 200-year journey into the heart of a paradox, forcing his descendants to live with a secret that was also their founding principle. The sin was not a bug in the system. It was the system itself. A political doctrine is a cold, abstract thing, but its consequences are paid in the currency of human lives, in shattered hearts and silent screams that echo in the corridors of power. The policy of dynastic inbreeding was not just a line in a history book. It was the lived daily reality for generations of Trần royals. It was a personal tragedy, reenacted over and over again. Our story begins where the last dynasty ended. With the two children at the center of Trần Thu Zhou's grand design, the 7-year-old Empress Li Qiu Huang and her 8-year-old cousin and husband, Trần Khan. Imagine the scene: two children, playmates in the gardens of the Forbidden City, suddenly thrust into the roles of husband and wife, emperor and empress. Their wedding was not a celebration of love, but a cold, political transaction. Can you picture the confusion in their eyes, the weight of the silken robes, the heavy crowns, the unblinking stares of the court mandarins? They were partners in a game whose rules they could not comprehend. Written by adults for the brutal prize of a nation, for a time, perhaps, they found solace in each other's company. Two lonely children in a vast, cold palace. But the clock was ticking. A queen's duty, an empress's sole purpose in this political machine, was to produce a male heir, to forge the next link in the chain, and Li Qiu Huang, now a teenager, failed to do so. After a decade of marriage, she had borne no living son. The pressure would have been immense, a crushing weight of expectation from the court, from the formidable Trần Thu Zhou, and from her own husband, now the Emperor Trần Thái Tông. Every month without news would have been a fresh failure, every whispered rumor a dagger in her heart. She was the last of the Li bloodline, a living ghost in a court that bore her family's name but now belonged to another. Her value was tied entirely to her womb, and her womb was silent. Then, the ultimate cruelty, Trần Thu Zhou, the architect of her fate, delivered the final blow. He saw another path to securing the succession. The emperor's elder brother had a wife, Princess Thuan Thien, who was pregnant. She, too, was a member of the Li royal family, making her bloodline acceptable, in a move of breathtaking ruthlessness. Trần Thu Zhou forced Emperor Trần Thái Tông to demote Empress Li Qiuhuang and take his own pregnant sister-in-law as his new empress. Pause for a moment and absorb the sheer horror of this. The emperor is forced to cast aside his wife of 10 years, the companion of his childhood, for her own sister or close relative. The princess is forced to leave her husband to marry his brother, while carrying her first husband's child. And Li Qiuhuang, the girl who was once the ruler of an entire nation, is stripped of her title, her husband, her dignity, and her future, all because she could not produce a son. She was demoted to the rank of princess and eventually forced to marry a minor general. Her story is one of the most profound tragedies in Vietnamese history, a life sacrificed on the altar of dynastic ambition. If you were her, Li Qiuhuang, what would you feel? A pawn from birth, a wife in a political play, a queen judged solely by her fertility, and finally, a ghost discarded when she was no longer useful. The silence of her chambers must have been deafening, but her tragedy was not an anomaly. It was the blueprint. It established a precedent. The needs of the bloodline superseded all morality, all personal affection, all human decency. The machine had to be fed, and so the pattern was set. The next emperor, Tran Thanh Tong, married Princess Thien Kam, who was his first cousin. Their son, the future emperor Tran Nan Tong, the very man who would lead the nation to its final victory against the Mongols and later abdicate the throne to become a Buddhist patriarch, was a product of this union. Think of the paradox: a man who sought ultimate spiritual purity was born from a union considered by many to be impure. The court of the Tran must have been a bewildering place. Your aunt might also be your mother-in-law. Your wife is your first cousin. The family dinner is a council of state. The lines between domestic and political life, between affection and duty, were irrevocably blurred. Every marriage was a political alliance. Every birth a strategic victory. Love, if it existed, was a fortunate accident, not a prerequisite. For generations, this was the norm. Cousins married cousins. The circle of power remained unbroken, closed to all outsiders. The strategy, from a purely political standpoint, was a stunning success. It created a core of leadership so unified, so loyal to the clan, that it could withstand the unimaginable pressure of the Mongol invasions. When the nation faced an existential threat, there were no squabbling in-laws from rival families, no competing claims to power. There was only the Tran clan, standing as one. They had bought security, but the price was paid by individuals like Li Qiuhuang. Yet, even within this rigid system, there were those who saw the danger. Not the political danger, but a deeper, more elemental one. The most powerful voice of dissent came from the dynasty's greatest hero, Commander Tran Hung Jiao. Tran Hung Jiao was the supreme military commander during all 3 Mongol invasions. He was a prince of the royal blood, a cousin to the emperor. He was the living embodiment of Tran's strength. Yet he, more than anyone, seemed to understand the precipice on which his family was perched. There is a famous story in which he, wanting to test the loyalty of his sons, asked them in private what they would do if he decided to seize the throne for himself. His eldest son remained silent, a dangerous ambiguity, but his youngest son, Pham Ngu Lao, an adopted son, famously, immediately counseled against it. But the most telling moment came when it was proposed that his son, Tran Quoc Tang, marry a royal princess. This was the ultimate prize, a marriage that would place his direct line at the very heart of the succession. It was the dream of every other noble family, Tran Hung Jiao flatly refused. His reason, recorded for all of history, was a chillingly simple 5-word sentence. Our two families are too close. Let that sink in. The greatest warrior of the dynasty, the man who was the architect of its military immortality, refused to participate in its foundational social policy. He looked at the closed loop his family had created and saw not strength, but a potential weakness, a fragility, a violation of a natural order that even a dynasty of warriors should not tempt. He saw the ghosts of the future, the potential for decay hidden within the very purity they sought to protect. Now, I ask you to put yourself in his shoes. You are Tran Hung Jiao. You hold the love of the people, the respect of the army, and the ear of the emperor. You see the wisdom in the political strategy. You have benefited from the clan's unity. But you also feel an instinct, a primal warning, that this path is a dangerous one. Do you enforce the family doctrine to secure your own son's power? Or do you break the cycle, risking the political consequences for a principle you cannot even fully articulate? A danger you only feel in your bones. What would you do? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. The tragedy of the Tran is not just that they practiced inbreeding, it's that they knew, on some level, that it was wrong. They saw the cracks in the foundation, but their fear of the outside world was greater than their fear of the darkness they were cultivating within. They continued to feed the machine, generation after generation, unaware that the bill for their sacred sin would one day come due. For centuries, the story of the Tran was one of politics, morality, and fate. The warnings of men like Tran Hung Jiao were based on intuition, a sense of natural order. But today, we can leave the 13th century for a moment and step into the sterile light of the 21st century laboratory. We can now translate their sacred sin into the cold, precise language of science. We can analyze their strategy through the lenses of genetics, psychology, and sociology. First, the genetics. Why is inbreeding, or consanguinity, so biologically risky? Imagine that your entire genetic code, your DNA, is a vast library containing thousands of instruction manuals for building and running your body. Every person has 2 copies of almost every manual, one from each parent. Most of the time, these manuals are perfect, but occasionally, a manual contains a typo, a small error, what we call a recessive allele. As long as your other copy of the manual is correct, the typo doesn't cause a problem. The correct instructions override the faulty ones. The typo remains hidden, a silent passenger in your DNA. The problem arises when 2 people who are related have a child. Because they share a recent common ancestor, like a grandparent, they are much more likely to carry the exact same hidden typos in their genetic library. When they have a child, there's a significant chance, a 25% chance for first cousins, for any given recessive gene, that the child will inherit 2 copies of the faulty manual. With no correct copy to override it, the typo is no longer silent. It becomes a reality. This is how rare genetic diseases, called autosomal recessive disorders, suddenly appear. Things like cystic fibrosis, sickle cell anemia, or Tay-Sachs disease. While we have no preserved DNA from the Tran royals to test, we can look at other, more well-documented royal families who practiced the same strategy. The most famous example is the Habsburg dynasty of Spain. For nearly 200 years, they married uncle to niece, first cousin to first cousin, to keep power concentrated. The result was a gallery of genetic problems, most famously the Habsburg jaw, a severe mandibular prognathism that made it difficult for them to eat and speak. The last Habsburg king of Spain. Charles II was a tragic figure. He was riddled with so many physical and mental disabilities, a direct result of generations of inbreeding, that he was sterile. The very strategy designed to preserve the bloodline ended up extinguishing it. Could the Tran have faced similar issues? It's impossible to know for sure. Historical chronicles are not genetic textbooks. They might mention a ruler being of frail health or dying young, but they wouldn't attribute it to the emperor's parents being cousins. Yet, the biological risk was there. A silent game of Russian roulette played with every royal birth. Each generation that turned inward increased the odds of pulling the genetic trigger. But the science isn't just biological. We must also look at the psychology and sociology of a system like this. What does it do to the human mind? This creates a powerful clan fortress or siege mentality. From birth, a Tran royal would be taught that their identity, safety, and prosperity were inextricably linked to the clan. The outside world is not just different, it is a threat. Outsiders are rivals, potential usurpers. This intense in-group preference is a powerful social glue. It fosters extreme loyalty and unity, which was undoubtedly effective during the Mongol Wars. However, it comes at a tremendous psychological cost. It creates a claustrophobic social reality. There is no escape, no outside to run to. Your family is also your government. A personal disagreement can become a political crisis. Furthermore, it confuses the very nature of human relationships. How does a child process the fact that their mother is also their aunt, that their spouse is the playmate they grew up with as a sibling figure? This blurring of sacred familial lines can create deep-seated psychological tension and a distorted understanding of social norms. For the women, the psychological burden was immense. They were reduced to their biological function. Their value was not in their intelligence, their kindness, or their personality, but in their ability to produce a healthy male heir for the clan. The story of Li Qiuhuang and Empress Thuan Tien is a brutal illustration of this. They were not people. They were vessels for the perpetuation of the bloodline. The anxiety, the fear of failure, the constant scrutiny, it's a form of psychological torture sanctioned by the state. The Trần Dynasty's strategy, therefore, was a double-edged sword. Genetically, it loaded the gun. Sociologically, it created a powerful but brittle fortress. Psychologically, it inflicted untold damage on its own members. They may have seen it as a necessary evil to protect their power, but from a scientific perspective, they were launching a multi-generational experiment in biological and social fragility. The strength they projected to the world was built upon a secret, internal weakness that grew with every passing year. Let us pull back from the specifics of history and science and gaze upon the Trần Dynasty's story from a philosophical distance. What timeless questions does their dilemma raise about the nature of power, sacrifice, and the haunting concept of purity? The Trần were not alone. Their strategy, while shocking, was not unique. Across the globe and throughout history, ruling classes have often turned inward to protect their power. The Ptolemaic dynasty of ancient Egypt, founded by a general of Alexander the Great, practiced sibling marriage for nearly 3 centuries. Cleopatra Tsephen, the famous Cleopatra, was the product of generations of such unions and married 2 of her own brothers. Their justification was the same as the Trans, to keep the divine royal bloodline pure and contained, to emulate the gods like Isis and Osiris, and most importantly, to prevent power from leaking out of the Macedonian Greek ruling class into the native Egyptian population. The royal houses of Europe, particularly the Habsburgs, were a vast, tangled web of intermarriage. Their motto could well have been, Bella gerant alii, tu, Felix Austria, noobs. Let others wage war, you, happy Austria, marry. But they married each other, weaving a tapestry of power that covered the continent. They traded genetic diversity for diplomatic and territorial security. What this reveals is a fundamental, almost primal fear inherent in consolidated power, the fear of dilution. The fear of the other power, once gained, becomes a precious substance that must be guarded. To these dynasties, marrying an outsider was not just a personal choice. It was a political risk, a potential breach in the fortress wall. By practicing endogamy, marrying within the group, they believed they were preserving their most valuable asset. But this raises a profound philosophical question. What is purity? The Trans sought a pure bloodline. But what did they get? They achieved a politically pure clan, a monolith of singular purpose and loyalty. This purity gave them the strength to perform one of the greatest military feats in world history. But in their quest for this political purity, did they sacrifice a more essential, human purity? A moral purity is a system that requires a man to discard his childhood love for her pregnant sister. Pure is a court where familial love is subverted for strategic gain. Pure is a bloodline that knowingly risks frailty and disease in its future generations. Pure. The irony is devastating. In their attempt to purify and strengthen their lineage, they may have introduced a different kind of poison, a moral and spiritual decay. The actions of Tran Thu Zhou, while politically brilliant, were morally monstrous. This foundational act, this original sin of the dynasty, colored everything that came after. It normalized the idea that the clan was an entity more important than the individuals within it, that the abstraction of the dynasty justified any human cost. This is the great paradox of the Tran. Their greatest strength was born from their greatest transgression. Their moments of sublime, heroic unity on the battlefield were financed by acts of private, intimate cruelty in the palace. They saved the body of the nation by sickening their own soul. This forces us to confront an uncomfortable question about leadership and governance. Is it ever justifiable to commit a profound moral wrong for a perceived greater good? We often celebrate leaders who make tough choices, but the Tran story pushes this to its absolute limit. They didn't just make a tough choice. They adopted a systemic moral violation as state policy. Does their victory against the Mongols vindicate their methods? Does saving millions of lives from the horde excuse the psychological destruction of individuals like Li Qiuhuang? There is no easy answer. It is a problem that sits at the nexus of consequentialist ethics. The ends justify the means. And deontological ethics, certain actions are inherently wrong, regardless of the outcome. The Tran dynasty stands as a monument to this impossible equation. They are a testament to the fact that power often demands a terrible price, not just from the conquered, but from the conquerors themselves. They built an empire that could defeat any external foe, but they may have planted a time bomb in their own heart. A slow-acting poison that would, in the end, contribute to their own undoing. Their quest for purity led them down a path of profound complication, leaving us to wonder if true strength can ever be built on a foundation of transgression. It's easy to look back at the 13th century Tran court and see their practices as relics of a distant, brutal past. We live in a globalized world. We have sequenced the human genome. We talk about diversity and inclusion. Surely, We have evolved beyond such primitive, self-destructive behavior. Or have we? The fundamental driver behind the trans strategy was not a lack of scientific knowledge. It was a human impulse, one that is terrifyingly alive and well. Today, the obsessive desire to consolidate power and protect it from outside influence. The Tran built a dynasty of blood. Today, we build dynasties of wealth, politics, and ideology. The principle remains the same. The inbreeding is no longer genetic, but metaphorical, and it is just as dangerous. Consider the world of corporate dynasties and nepotism. Look at family-run empires where leadership is passed down from father to son, from mother to daughter, regardless of merit. The belief is the same as the trans. Only a member of the family can be trusted with the bloodline, which in this case is the company's legacy and fortune. They create a closed loop. Key positions are filled by relatives. The board of directors becomes a family reunion. They stop listening to outside voices, to disruptive ideas, to warnings from the market. They believe their purity of vision is their strength. This is corporate inbreeding, and it often leads to the same result as genetic inbreeding: fragility and collapse. The company becomes slow to adapt, blind to innovation. It suffers from the founder's curse, where the skills that built the empire are not the skills needed to sustain it in a changing world. Think of companies that once seemed invincible, like Kodak. They invented the first digital camera but failed to embrace it, partly because their internal culture was a closed loop, deeply invested in the old world of film. Their refusal to marry an outside idea led to their downfall. They created their own Habsburg jaw, a corporate structure so rigid it could no longer adapt to a new environment. Now, expand this to the realm of politics. We see political families that span generations, where a famous surname is the primary qualification for office. Power is kept in the family, not just for one clan, but for an entire political class. These political elites often attend the same schools, join the same clubs, and marry within their own social strata. They create a bubble, a political echo chamber where their own assumptions are constantly reinforced and outside perspectives are dismissed as naive, radical, or uninformed. They lose touch with the very people they are meant to govern. Just as the Tran royals, locked in their palace, were a world apart from the peasants in the rice paddies. But the most pervasive form of modern inbreeding is ideological. Welcome to the age of the algorithm, the social media bubble, and the personalized newsfeed. We have all become our own little Tran dynasties. We curate our reality, following people who think like us, reading news that confirms our biases, and unfriending or blocking those who challenge our worldview. We are practicing intellectual inbreeding. Our clan is our political party, our social tribe, our online community. Our bloodline is our ideology, and we guard it with the same ferocity as Tran Thujo. We view those with different political opinions not as fellow citizens with different ideas, but as an existential threat, an other whose victory means our annihilation. This intellectual inbreeding makes us weaker, not stronger. It starves our minds of cognitive diversity, the very thing needed for critical thinking, problem-solving, and compromise. It makes us susceptible to groupthink and radicalization. It creates a society that is not a unified nation, but a collection of warring clans, each locked in its own fortress of belief. The lesson of the Tran dynasty, then, is a chillingly modern one. It's a warning against the seductive allure of the closed system. Whether that system is a bloodline, a boardroom, a political party, or a social media feed, the principle is the same. The moment we decide that purity and security are best achieved by walling ourselves off from the outside, we begin to decay. We trade the messy, unpredictable, but ultimately resilient strength of diversity for the tidy, clean, but brittle weakness of conformity. The Tran feared losing their throne to a rival lord. We fear losing our sense of identity and certainty in a complex and confusing world. And we often resort to the same solution: we turn inward. We marry our own ideas, give birth to sterile dogmas, and create a generation of thoughts that are too frail to survive contact with reality. The ghost of Tran Thu Zhou lives on, not in the palaces of Vietnam, but in the algorithms of Silicon Valley and the halls of modern power, forever whispering the same tempting, fatal advice: keep it in the family. So we return to the fields of Jai Viet, to the ghosts of the Trần Dynasty. What are we to make of them? Are they heroes or monsters, saviors or sinners? The truth, as it so often is in the dark corners of history, is that they were both. They are a paradox, frozen in time. The Trần Dynasty is a testament to the fact that a thing can be both a spectacular success and a catastrophic failure at the same time. Their strategy of inbreeding worked. It secured their power, unified their leadership, and created the conditions necessary to defeat a world-conquering empire. That is a historical fact. But that same strategy was a moral failing, a biological gamble, and a psychological burden that inflicted profound suffering on its own people. That, too, is a fact. Their story denies us the comfort of a simple judgment. We cannot neatly place them in a box labeled good or evil. We are left instead with an open wound, a question that history itself cannot answer. It is the story of humanity in microcosm, our capacity for brilliant strategy and profound cruelty, our yearning for security and our fear of the unknown, our ability to achieve greatness through means that diminish our own humanity. The fall of the Trần Dynasty was not, in the end, caused by a Mongol arrow or a peasant rebellion. It came from within. When a powerful court official, Ho Quy Lai himself related to the royals by marriage, did exactly what Trần Thu Zhou had feared. He usurped the throne, ending the dynasty that had sacrificed so much to protect itself from that very fate. The fortress, in the end, was breached from the inside. The ultimate irony: the legacy of the Trần is not written in stone, but in water. It is a shifting, shimmering reflection of our own choices. Their story holds up a dark mirror and asks us, what walls are you building? What are you trying to keep pure? Your family, your company, your country, your beliefs, and what are you sacrificing to do it? What is the price you are willing to pay for the illusion of perfect security? The ghosts of the Trần court do not offer answers. They only offer their story. A cautionary tale whispered on the wind. A reminder that the most formidable walls we build are often the ones that become our prisons. What do you think was the Trần Dynasty's strategy? A justifiable act of political survival, or an unforgivable moral transgression? Share your complex thoughts in the comments below. And if you find yourself drawn to the shadows where power, tragedy, and history collide, then subscribe to Dark History. Ring the bell of notification so you never miss another journey into the fascinating abyss of our shared past. There are always more secrets waiting to be unearthed.